I'll give you the nod when we're live.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Australian Reptile Park. This is Gizmo. He's a little 2-year-old male koala. And needless to say, I'm talking about koalas today. It happens to be pouring with rain out there. So Gizmo and I are both dry. And I thought that without the activities of feeding or weighing or those things that I've done past few weeks, that maybe I would pinch your ear and just talk a little about koalas generally, the bushfires that ravage their populations, and maybe just go over that, I guess, from a bit of a discussional capacity, and then we can talk about little Gizmo himself. But we should all be very aware that bushfires ravaged East Coast Australia in the earlier part of this year and the end of last year. Now, koalas, before the bushfires, had already lost 90% of their former habitat. And they've got one major problem, and that is they live in Eastern Australia, where we like to live, and where there's a lot of agriculture. So land clearing had reduced their habitat from 90% of what it was pre-Europeans' arrival in Australia. You then come with a whole range of problems. So we're before the fires, but they lost 90% of their habitat. So what's left is really fragmented. And fragmentation is very dangerous. When you get fragmentation, what that means is Gizmo can't reach another population. So you can get genetic bottlenecks and you can get inbreeding. And when you've got that fragmentation, you've got a population here or a population there, they can't make it to each other. And that also has the complexity that if you have something like a catastrophic fire in one koala population, who repopulates? For all of history, when fires burnt, and perhaps not to the intensity that we saw, and that's a different discussional point, but for all of history, when one area burns, it regrows. It will have suffered some devastation, but it regrows, and animals move back in. But when we've created fragmented pockets, Gizmo and his kin can't get to the next spot, and that comes with all types of complexities. So you've got mass fragmentation. You've then got, because of urban sprawl and us, you've got road strike, which is a major factor. Koalas run over by cars. You've got dog attack. And you've got, obviously, the catastrophic fires. Now, fires burnt nearly 80% of koala habitat in New South Wales, a really big number. And, this number of species or individual animals lost to those fires was 1 billion. 1 billion. And, for my mind, whether that's correct or not, does it really matter if it was 500 million or 2 billion? It was just incredibly bad. And you think, Gizmo here, as a koala, he has a home range in the wild of between 2 and 5 hectares. That's one koala. But within that 2 to 5 hectares, can you even begin to imagine how many small birds, small frogs, small lizards, geckos, and invertebrates like spiders? The overall loss of biodiversity was just incredible. So what's the future look like for koalas? Well, again, before the fires, koalas were on a trajectory to be extinct in New South Wales by 2050. And that means the rate of their decline was putting them on an extinction crash course 30 years from now. Now you go back, 100 years, and there were times in history where 3 million koalas in 1 year were exported through ports of Australia for their fur. He's being cheeky, you guys move one way and he goes the other. You don't like the camera, mate. 3 million koalas were culled for their fur. Now, that's shocking. But the reason I say that number is because in Queensland now, you've got low thousands of koalas left. The entire population in Queensland, low thousands. But at one point, there were millions that went at one time. So you get an idea of how radically that population has already been hit. So we saw a lot of burnt koalas through the fires, and that's tragic, and they don't survive. We saw a lot of burnt habitat, and with the intensity of the fires, it was incinerated. It's not a low intensity fire on the ground and koalas can take refuge in the trees. It was incinerated. So what does the future look like for them? Well, one example is AussieARC, which is a not-for-profit conservation program, very heavily related to the reptile park. We manage fire-affected areas and fire-affected species. Now, we have an existing wild koala population, but we have a few thousand hectares. And I don't mean to down-talk that, but it's home to maybe 500 koalas. It's not enough to say the future of the species is safe. But what we need is better management, not just from the capacity of fire prevention, but invasive weeds, feral pests, urban sprawl, roads, dog attacks, to give these guys a fighting chance. Now, the other thing they suffer from quite radically is disease, chlamydia and a retrovirus, which is an autoimmune disease, and that's seeing numbers plummet in itself. So again, at AussieARC, whilst we've got a wild koala population there, and we can manage fire, weed, feral pest, all these things, and we've got a partnership with Sydney University that will essentially genetically map and disease map our koalas, and through doing that, we'll actually aim to have a disease-free wild population of koalas, which would be a first of its kind. They range from North Queensland down to Victoria, used to be over in South Australia, not so much now. Islands like Kangaroo Island, whilst they got devastated by fire too, but koalas were actually introduced there because of the pressures on the fur trade 100 odd years ago. Some koalas were put to Kangaroo Island and islands like that because they thought they were already going to go extinct on mainland. And guess what? It didn't get much better. So little Gizmo here is a wonderful ambassador for his species. And I just will talk to you about koalas for a minute now and go through a few things. So if we have a look at, let's go through physical features. I'll just start with camouflage. If I just come down here a little, and right now, you're a bird of prey. When you look down at the koala, it's grey and brown. So it camouflages in with the trunk of the tree. And if you go down a bit and look up, you've got this white speckling all over the bottom. And imagine you're a goanna or a dingo, a terrestrial predator, and you look up. The koala's got basic camouflage that blends it into the tree. So whilst it doesn't look that in depth, they're still very reasonably camouflaged. And I have spent countless hours surveying for koalas. You can listen for males, but mostly you're trying to identify. You can use scent detection dogs that actually can sniff out koala droppings, their feces. It's the easiest way because it's on the ground. The dog gets a hit, it's found a dropping. I've stood there under trees and have looked for koalas, and you cannot see them. They blend in so well, and that's very, very necessary. But let's have a look. Ears, they're big and fluffy, but they actually have a really great sense of hearing. A lot of that is used through vocalisations of males calling out, letting people know, or females know that there's a male in town, or other males know that this is his territory. We come to the eyes. Their eyesight is not one of their better senses. It's not bad, but it certainly wouldn't be considered a great sense of vision. Now, come to this big honker of a nose, and their sense of smell is just wonderful. Now, the diet they eat is eucalyptus. Now, I'll come back to that in a minute to dispel a bit of a myth that's commonly out there. But the nose is used to be able to differentiate between a healthy, young, succulent leaf that they want to eat that's full of moisture, or an old leaf. To our nose, you would not be able to smell the difference. To them, they can do it very easily. Not just the species of tree, but the specific leaf they want to eat. Now, come up here and have a look. It's probably the best spot. See this here? 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. That's 2 thumbs, 3 fingers. Now, they've developed that through an evolutionary process that life in the trees is better if you've got 2 thumbs. If you've got 2 thumbs, it's simply better grip around a branch. I'm going to try and show you in on his chest. Oh, it's just coming through. Can you see this here? It's okay, mate. On his chest, there's not a lot to see because he hasn't developed it yet. But on his chest, you've actually got a scent gland right in the middle, and it'll often be a big dirty patch. Here you go. Have a look at this again. It's just starting to develop in the middle of his chest. Just that little dirty area there. And it smells like koala, but it tends to smell like eucalyptus. Everything about them smells like eucalyptus. And aside from that, you've got really soft hand pads that actually each have individual characteristics, like each individual fingerprint type hand pads. Now, I just want to go on to that myth that I mentioned, which I get asked so often. Are koalas drunk from their leaves? The short answer is no. Okay, the leaves are toxic, but they're not drunk. The reason they seem so sleepy so often is because of their diet. All they eat is eucalyptus. There's only 2 mammals in Australia, marsupials, the koala and the greater glider, a big species of glider. Now, both eat only eucalyptus. Now, the consequence is that eucalyptus is really low in energy, really low in nutrients. What's the best way to deal with that? the best way to deal with it is to conserve energy. And koalas have mastered it. One of the best ways of conserving energy is to be a little dopey and to sleep for 18 to 20 hours a day. And that conserves energy. Guess what they're doing when they're awake? Normally eating. So beyond that, how else do you conserve energy? Well, they have a really low metabolism. And it's not just with koalas, a lot of Australian animals. So we have a real big problem in Australia with the introduced feral fox and cat. Australia has the worst mammal extinction rate on Earth, especially our little small marsupials and mammals. And it's because of the fox and cat. Now, fox and cat are placental mammals, and Australia didn't have them. We had Tasmanian devils and tiger quolls, and they're different to placental mammals. Now, the fox and cat, they don't fit into our environments, not just because they don't belong here, but they've got a much higher metabolism. And what that means is they need to eat more food, and they have an even harder role on the environment. So coming back to koalas, by having a low metabolism means that it also conserves energy. They don't require as high a nutrient-rich food. And lastly, they've got one of the longest digestive systems on Earth for their size. And the reason they have that is because they eat the eucalyptus, and again, it's really low in nutrient. You got a fly on your snoz, mate. It's really low in nutrient, so they keep the food in there for so long to try and extract any goodness out of it. But remembering, koalas are not drunk from their food. They are sleepy because it's a mechanism for energy conservation. Now, one of the other questions really regularly asked is, do koalas drink water? Yes, they drink water. The right question is, do koalas need to drink water? The answer to that is no, normally not. On a normal year, they can get all the moisture they need from their leaves, from the food they eat, but bring in an intense drought or heat wave, they will drink. It's not uncommon for koalas to drink. It's just normally the case that they don't need it. Now, Gizmo is a 2-year-old male, and he'll live between 10 and 15 years. Lifespan in the wild is normally 10. In captivity, with a bit easier life, he can get to 15 years old. Now, at 2, and the size that he is, he'd be about 7 kilos. And so at this size, he's almost reaching sexual maturity. By 3, he's ready to breed. Same for females. Now, when they breed, remembering they're a marsupial. Their closest living relative is a wombat, which is funny because a wombat lives underground and a koala lives up in the tree, but they're related to kangaroos, possums, everything that has a pouch. And when they breed, male and female will mate, and that's something to behold. If you've never seen koalas mating, Google it. It's not a gentle process, but the reality is the female's in control the whole time. She wants a male that is going to burr up. She wants a strong male. She wants a male to show her that she's worthy of mating with her. So it actually is quite violent. But once they mate, and they only need to mate once, the female has a 35-day pregnancy. Do you hear that, ladies? 35 days. That's it. And it gives birth to a joey the size of a peanut. And the joey crawls from the cloaca up to the pouch, which is on the belly, and it fuses onto a teat. And it'll spend about the first 6 months of its life in there. And as it gets too big for the pouch, it begins to just live on mum's belly. And after that, lives on mum's back. And through that process, it learns how to climb, it learns how to feed, what to feed on, where to feed. And then, before a year old, it's independent. And normally, mum has another joey in the pouch at that time. Hey, Gizmo, I'm getting some pretty good cuddles here from the big boy. Do we have a few questions that people would like to ask?
We sure do. How can you tell the difference between boy and girl koalas?
How can you tell the difference between boy and girl koalas? Okay, well, let's start a little sciencey. You can normally look at the head shape. Males will have a bigger head. Females a little bit smaller, petite. A male koala could get up to 10, 11, 12 kilos. Females normally around 7 or 8 kilos. So you could just eyeball a population and sort of pick, that's a male, that's a female, based on a few of those characteristics. But otherwise, boys have the same things that humans do, and girls have pouches. So if you were to look at a female, just inside on her belly there, even a young koala like this, with a pre-developed pouch, will still have a pouch. It's just very small and doesn't have that depth. But otherwise, you've got the male genitalia and you've got the female's pouch that are probably the easiest ways to tell, aside from just head size and overall body mass.
What do baby koalas, do they drink milk?
Yeah. So I mentioned before about the feral fox and the feral cat as placental mammals. Humans are placental mammals, so we give live birth to a young. From a koala's perspective, from a marsupial perspective, so they give birth to a really pre-developed young, and it climbs into a pouch to finish off its development. And what they have in common, I mean, marsupials are still mammals, they drink milk. So a female koala has a teat inside her pouch, and whilst the pregnancy is really short, the joey is born, climbs into the pouch. When it's born, it has its eyes are covered in skin, its ears are folded down, it's totally pink, and it crawls into the pouch and it suckles from milk. That's its sole diet until it's big enough to eat eucalyptus leaves, which reminds me of a funny story, and that is koalas aren't born with the enzyme in their stomach to digest eucalyptus. So once they've finished drinking their milk and they're big and they're about to wean from mum, they go through a process that's called papping. And papping is where you eat your mum's poo. So mum will actually, biologically gets almost a type diarrhea. It's called papping, but it's like a diarrhea. So she actually will go to the toilet more often. This is all in a short period of hours and days. She'll go to the toilet more often and actually produce it so it comes out in a bit of a slurry. And it's really pre-digested, so there's still bits and pieces of leaves in there. The joey pokes its head out of the pouch and eats the pap. If it doesn't eat the pap, it can't digest eucalyptus. It's interesting when you hand rear a koala, let's say a little orphan or something like that, you must give it pap. There is no substitute for it. So what you need is other females that have joeys. You actually can go and pinch a bit of their poo and feed it to your little koala.
How many koalas do we have here at the Australian Reptile Park?
We have about 30 koalas at the Reptile Park. I mean, their main role here is that we learn everything we can about the captive breeding requirements of them. We make sure that they're disease-free. We try to have them genetically representative of their counterparts in the wild, and that there is classed as a bit of an insurance population, hopefully never needed, but meaning if worst case unfolded in the wild, you've got a separated population that's disease-free, genetically representative, behaviourally suitable, but about 30 koalas, and that's made up of about 10 boys and 20 females. And that's a pretty stable population for us.
So Gizmo seems pretty chill. Is this the kind of behaviour you'd see from a wild koala?
Yeah, good question, whoever asked that one. No, this is not how wild koalas behave if I was trying to hold one. Now, you wouldn't try and hold a wild koala, but certainly what we're seeing here is a koala Gizmo that is very comfortable with me holding him. And for him, it's just the same as like he's sitting in a branch. So in that sense, it's really typical wild koala behaviour, because if we saw a wild koala now, guess what it would be doing? This, or eating. So the behaviour you're seeing is typical, but if you tried to catch and hold a wild koala, they go feral. They'll bite, they'll scratch, they try and get away, they make these guttural groans that are just awful. So again, answering that two ways, if you tried to hold a wild koala, this is not what it's like. But the behaviour that we're seeing here from Gizmo is just typical of a koala that's content and calm and happy to have a cuddle.
All right, last question. What's your advice to people who want to support the koala as a species?
Yeah. Look, my advice to anyone that's interested in supporting native wildlife conservation, or in this capacity koalas, is that, and I'm sorry to keep it a little ambiguous, but just really do your research. I like projects that have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And you should be able to tick those three boxes to know that you are supporting a cause that has a vision, which essentially means, in one way or another, improves koalas in the wild. And that's very important. So you've got a range of projects. I can't help but obviously say AussieARC I'm president of AussieARC as well as director of Reptile Park, and AussieARC not only works with koalas, but we've got 10 flagship endangered species of devil and quoll and bandicoot and potteroo and rock wallaby. We've got a wild population of koalas that is lower density than it should be, but with the right management over the next 5-10 years, we should see that population explode, because our sanctuaries are reasonably new, but managing fire and feral pest and invasive weeds, we can provide great habitat for koalas that's safe and also have a disease-free population. So you want to support a cause, support AussieARC. That's what I believe in the most. Otherwise, if your interests are in things like rescue rehab, noting that that's a first, immediate type triage response, and we saw that wonderfully executed. But it's not really similar to conservation initiatives of koalas in the wild. That really is supporting koalas that have been burnt or displaced or hit by a car or something like that. So if that's your interest, you can look at the likes of Port Stephens Koala Hospital, Port Macquarie Koala Hospital, Lismore Koala Hospital. There's a whole bunch. But again, I just come back to that criteria that I would always look at, which is engage in a project that has a beginning, a middle and the end, and know that a result is going to be delivered and your contribution really has an impact towards what you want it to. Okay, I'm getting the nod. That's all for me and Gizmo. Thanks for tuning in. Sorry we weren't outside with a bit more activity, but hopefully that gives a pretty good overview of koalas and the species and fires and Gizmo, and we'll see you all next time.